it was so ludicrous that was actually given as a reason. And I'll tell you why. Partly because the FBI report, which I can't remember if I mentioned last time I was on the show, but we didn't have this. We didn't have access to the SO15s. It's like a counterterrorism report detailing their investigation into, the deaths of the 10 victims, including my brother, who had this joint inquest. And the coroner relied on that, and the Attorney General referred to, that the coroner had basically relied on this, on the 9/11 Commission report and the FBI investigation. So this report, we finally got hold of it, but after we'd initially submitted the application 2 years ago. And, I'm expecting something in there that's going to be a bit juicy, a bit meaty, some decent investigation by our counterterrorism people. There's 3 pages, pretty much cut and paste from the 9/11 Commission report, which gives no more than a timeline, and it's complete with American spelling. And you have a single page, which is the FBI investigation, which again looks like a cut and paste about the Zacharias Masui trial. That's the evidence that was put in front of the coroner as to the causation of how the towers came down and my brother's death. It's so ludicrous, and so, yeah, I mean, the people who responded, both the Attorney General response in June, people do just rely on the official narrative. But in this case, they were relying on something that had absolutely no bearing on my brother's, causation of death. I don't know. Part of me just sort of thinks there's a lot of idiots. I'm not using the defense of, they're not very smart, but I'm scratching my head as to how they could be so incompetent. But yeah, it's the fact that people just blindly follow the official narrative drives me crazy on anything. Particularly the last few years, it's been very obvious that something's not right.
Actually, before I ask you my question, let me just rather do a quick break. I'll be back to you shortly. My name is Jerm, chatting to Matt Campbell. This is TNT Radio, and when Alex decides to wake up, we'll go to an ad break.
TNT Radio's Charlie Robinson.
For people that are sort of coming to this information recently and don't really know, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, it's kind of hard to tell sometimes. I agree, it is hard to tell, but I'll tell you what, if you want a good barometer for this, anybody that is working for or with the United Nations, they're the bad guys, okay? It's pretty simple. They're not uniting nations in a peace and harmony and kumbaya sort of way. They're uniting nations into a world government. The United Nations was started by David Things and
Business Tip .live.
Listen to it wherever I go.
TNT.
Right. I mean, they basically had 14 days to respond after we sent our substantive grounds to them on the 11th of September. And yeah, so we heard back from them, and today would have been the day for filing in the High Court, and we prepared the barrister prepared all the bundles of legal cases that we were referring to, plus obviously, our entire application that we'd submitted 2 years ago. So a lot of work, was kind of in progress and ready to go, and then they backed down. So, I mean, thankfully, I don't think anyone wants to go into litigation. There's always costs, that pile up on both sides, because they've backed down, we don't need to file in the High Court. Like I said, it is basically an implicit admission that their original decision was legally deficient, and I can't see how they can make any other decision other than to grant permission this time around. But yeah, we have not filed in the High Court, thank God.
I think there's a difference, Matt, between what happens legally and officially and what happens, in a pub. Do you think that these folks, these legal folks, do you think they actually believe the nonsense that they're propagating?
Who are you talking about specifically? My barrister, or in general the system?
Yeah, in general the system. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think it depends, I guess, which side you're on and where you're fighting. What's become very obvious to me is if you haven't got money, you'd get nowhere. We would not be in this position. Basically, I would have had to accept that decision. Well, we probably wouldn't have even filed the petition in the first place. It would have been a sort of, a homemade version, which would have probably been thrown out, without merit back, way back 2 years ago. No, I mean, I think there's like any system and company and organization, there are good people working in there. And I think some do their best within the system, and like we all do. And, obviously for some, it's a useful, I guess, get out of jail card. I think the system does benefit certainly those with money and influence. But I do also believe that, certainly my experience of just talking to some people in the UK have been through similar processes with the judicial review, for example. You can get some justice. It's just like I think I referred to before, it's lawfare. It takes a lot of time. You're going to be exhausted both mentally, and particularly if it's an emotional case, it's going to, take its toll. And of course, it requires funds. And yeah, so in that respect, I'm very frustrated with the system that, it isn't fair for all. It definitely does favor those with the resources to fight. But luckily through the generosity of people who have listened to your show and to other interviews that I've done, who have donated money to help me fight getting a new inquest for my brother and getting the truth out there. We've been in this fortunate position. My barrister, is very, I don't know if they're supposed to say things officially, but he's very on side. He's very helpful. And I mean, what was it? He said the other day on his off day, he decided to watch the new documentary that's come out about Graham McQueen, which is called Peace, War and 9/11, which is based on the work of Graham McQueen, the sort of peace activist. And, he watched that. It's an hour and a half. He doesn't have to watch those sort of things if he doesn't necessarily, believe in what we're doing. So, but, like I say, I'm pretty sure there's lots of people in the system who do genuinely, try their hardest, and they believe that the system can work and justice can be, particularly if it's that sort of case, can be won and found.
Well, clearly, like me, you don't believe the official story. So what do you think, Matt, is the truth?
I wouldn't say I don't believe the official. I think there's lots of parts of the official story that I really don't think are true, or I think at best it's a kind of an embellished story. I mean, it's a large subject to cover. I think what's more telling is the stuff that you can't access, that is there. And so, I've lost count of how many freedom of information requests I've done for various aspects of the attacks. That's people, that's stuff to do with planes, stuff to do with buildings. It took me a year to get the structural drawings of the core of the towers off NIST. A year. At one point I remember just saying, like, is it NIST's policy to deliberately frustrate victim family members with simple requests? Because it was a fairly straightforward request. They have access to electronic versions of the core, because the perimeter structural diagrams are always available. They were released a long time ago, but the core never was. And stuff like that just drives me crazy, and when the FBI try and push you around and try and kind of just make it, just their responses are quite obtuse. These files may or may not exist, or this is kind of I can't remember. There's a whole range of responses that they tend to give, which just frustrate me. And whether that be the Saudi Arabian cases, I didn't realize there's actually 5. I only thought there was 2 cases against lawsuits against Saudi Arabia. The FBI, I can't remember what the operation was called back in 2016. There's so many files that have just been covered up. That's what Biden signed a couple of years ago to release all those documents. Like, how can we be 20 odd years down the line and still not have access to these files? Even if they're partially redacted, I don't care. Just why aren't they available? They should be, open source. We should be able to see these. Researchers, journalists, whatever, should be able to look at all these documents easily. Who are they protecting 22 years down the line,
In the live chat, Holly is asking, how many inquests have there been?
Into my brother, or just in general in the UK?
I suppose the latter, because why would she be asking about your brother only?
Yeah.
I guess.
Well, yeah. So, to my knowledge, I mean, it's really hard to find out. At one point, I was in a lot of discussion with the Met, the police force in the UK, because we had an assigned liaison officer. And one of the questions I asked was, look, I know that my brother had his inquest in 2013. It was a joint one with 9 other victims, because their remains had been identified and repatriated back to the UK. So effectively, to answer Holly's question, there's been 10 inquests that I know of. That was not covered at all in the press. I can't find any mention of the fact that, the biggest terrorism attack in terms of killing certainly British victims, wasn't covered at all by the media. I don't know if other people have had an inquest in this country. I doubt it, because I've been following very closely new remains that are identified, or new victims that are identified over in the States. And, obviously looking for a British victim, because I'm in contact with, a number of the families in this country, some of whom support, but none of them publicly, what I'm doing. But yeah, it's one of those things. It's frustrating. I think we're probably, one of the 10 inquests that have been held out of the 67 victims. But bear in mind, though, Jerm, some of the victims, even if they're British, if they were in America and they lived in America, for example, and their family's over there, they may have been buried there. And only by repatriating remains do you actually automatically trigger an inquest in this country.
You said 67. Is that how many British people died in the buildings?
Yeah. No, in total. I think there was one chap on one of the planes. But yes, it's 67. But I don't know the exact numbers of how many of those have been identified. I mean, what I can tell people is it's still 40% of everyone who died at World Trade Center has not been identified. There's 1,104 people. Nothing.
I don't understand that. Sorry, Matt. I'm just trying to figure that out. I'm trying to wrap my head around that. At some point, a family member somewhere is going to say, "Well, one of my brothers or sisters is missing." How do they just not know? Do people just vanish?
Oh, no. Sorry, they are reported missing, and they've been given death certificates, but without remains. So we know that so whatever 2,600 people died at the World Trade Center. What I'm saying is 1,104 have not been identified. So of the remaining remains, there's about 7,000 fragments. In theory, some of those 1,104 people could be part of those remains and could be identified at some point in the future. But I do know, because I've had quite a few chats, and I still face-to-face meetings with the medical examiner in New York, but also email exchanges. The rate at which they are identifying remains is a trickle now. It's this year alone, I think they've only had about 60 new identifications, of which only 2 people were new victims. So they're basically repeat identifications of people they've already found. And so, it's a similar case with my brother. We had 4 tranches of remains found, repeated identifications of the same individual. Yeah. So that's typically what's happening. So to only have 60 in a year is really slow. I remember when I first started talking to the OCME over in New York, they were doing that a month. So even though the tech's getting better, DNA testing, it's still, it's very, very slow now. So, the chances of a new victim being identified is slim. I think it was 2 this year, and there was none since 2021. And I think there was 1 then. And then it's been another couple of years prior to that before they've had a new identification of an individual. So, yeah.
And just to bring this down to the ground, to reality. When they talk about identifying individuals, they're talking about bits and pieces of people that are still found 20 years later somewhere in New York.
No, so the remains they were stored. So there's 22,000 fragments, I know that 5,000 of those are smaller than an inch, so 2.5 centimeters in new money, whatever. And of those 22,000, 14,000 have been identified. I presume a lot of those have been, reconnected with loved ones and, burials, etc. But the remains before the museum opened were stored in the medical examiner's office up on, I think, northeast Manhattan. But when the museum opened, they now store all the remains in a repository alongside the museum. And so I guess when they do testing, they take with the new tech, whenever they apply it, they take the remains out of the repository and then test them either on site or back in northeast. I don't know. I'm guessing on site. I'd have thought they'd have testing facilities there now. So yeah, that's what they do.
You've spent a long time trying to get to the bottom of this. Why?
I mean, it's a good question. I don't like the idea that 9/11 is, defines me, but I know it's been a huge part of my life. I started questioning stuff end of October 2001, and then as more and more information came in, your head starts to explode with like, how the hell can we still not know the truth? Because bits and pieces do come, out. But no one seems to want to either connect the dots or do actually anything about it, whether it be just holding people accountable or starting criminal proceedings. That just doesn't seem to be happening. What drove me, I guess, was just I want to know what happened to my brother, and I don't like the fact that he's almost been dismissed with this whitewash of an official narrative. I mean, I said at his inquest, I think the coroner barely spent 2 or 3 minutes dealing with him. The whole inquest for 10 people was done in about an hour and 45 minutes. I don't feel there's been any justice. There's not been any real investigation into all the things that we know are wrong with the official narrative. And, and one of the things is just purely, my poor old mum, myself and her are the only people in the family who sort of seen and held Jeff's remains. My younger brother, Rob, just didn't want to remember Geoff that way. My dad is the same. And, some of the remains, the small bone fragments, etc. But the remains we identified in 2008 were basically his scalp, his hair, bit of his face and his jaw. And that's, mum had to look at that, and she took a little lock of his hair. But those sort of things drive me to try and get some sort of justice and truth for my brother.
Yeah, I mean, this is a conversation that is almost never had, because people always talk about the actual incident, but not the reality, the stories like yours, the actual people who were involved and affected.
I mean, what do they say? Time heals and all the rest of it. I think it just accommodates grief a bit more, because that never goes away. And, I used to always be thinking about my brother daily. I try now not to, certainly not in a very sort of maudlin way. And, I've had to do a lot of healing and stuff to get over, the impact that my brother's death had on me. But, a couple of weeks ago, we typically have a kind of an annual get together, drinks and food with some of my brother's old mates, from uni and other walks of life. And, a conversation that my mum and my brother's best friend had, was really about the impact that 9/11 had on him. As he lost his best mate, and that hole that's never been replaced, over the years. And grief's a weird thing, but it's driving me, and I think my brother actually probably be horrified if he knew what I was doing, because it has absorbed a lot of my time. But you can't unsee things. I'm one of those people that once I've seen something, that's it. I can't undo that and just go, oh, I'll forget about that. That doesn't matter anymore, you know. And I won't stop, you know. So to the system and the forces out there listening, you know, I'm not going to give up. And I go back to what the decision we've just had. I think that's a very clear signal to them that, you know, we're not going to back down, and we've got everything. And so, you know, they need to back down and let us get this into a court of law. And so, yeah.
But I mean, you are being driven by something bigger than just, you know, going to court and finding out. Because think about this, right? You could just simply accept the official story. You know, why fight it? I mean, it's not going to change the reality.
No, I mean, okay, so yeah, you're dead right. It's not going to change. It's not going to bring my brother back. Other reasons for me fighting are, and it's what woke me up as well, was the, you know, illegal wars that were going on in Afghanistan initially, and then obviously Iraq and all the other countries that followed in the war on terror. You know, that drives me up, but that's not going to change, and it's not going to change anything, you know, really. It's that truth. And I think, you know, we talked about what, you know, 9/11 being an event that, you know, people start to question stuff, or that he said it's a moment in time that, you know, perhaps got people thinking about the, you know, the world in a different way. And you know, for me, wherever you are, an event, it might be 9/11, it might be something else, but if you are already awake and aware that perhaps, you know, those official stories you get told all the time by the mainstream media and our governments, etc., they perhaps need a little bit more, you know, examination. You're not necessarily going to fall for the same trick time and time again. And so, you know, that's another driver for me doing, you know, what I'm doing, for me personally, but also just, you know, other people. Because you can't believe it until it hits you. Yeah. You know, when something like, yeah, go on.
No, I was just going to say, but I think that's exactly the point, that there's something deeper and more profound that drives you. And that's what makes us, you know, special, makes us what we are.
I think we all have inner drive. I mean, you know, whether you're into sports or whatever, you know, you have to have an inner drive. It can't be external. No one's pushing me to do this. You know, it's something I feel compelled to do, and I'm going to continue doing it, you know, as long as I can.
Let's just quickly go to a break. My name is Jerm, chatting to Matt Campbell. This is TNT Radio.
They're back. The mRNA COVID jab is being pushed by corporations and governments around the world. But Alex Berenson says, don't take it.
From Washington, D.C., this is the Morano Minute with your host, TNT Radio.
Okay, Matt, let's go into something slightly more uplifting, I guess, because it's a pretty somber conversation. What is the official story versus the truth in 2 days' time?
On
4 days' time. 4 days' time, I mean, sorry. Yes.
Yeah, so I am speaking at an event in London, in Camden. I think it starts sort of 2 o'clock, 1:30, something like that. And I'm going to be basically giving an update on, you know, the news we've just had, going into a bit more detail, and obviously, you know, a presentation and slides and stuff. There's a talk by Piers Robinson. I don't know if you've ever been on TNT Radio. Yeah. He's a propaganda expert. Yeah. So he's going to be coming along talking about propaganda and, you know, events, deep structured events like JFK, 9/11, and more recently COVID. And we're also going to be screening the Graham McQueen new documentary called Peace, War and 9/11, which I should say, put a little plug for my brother-in-law, who was co-director and editor of the film. He's a filmmaker in the UK, does documentaries and stuff. And I was kind of involved in a lesser scale of things, just doing a bit of research for them. But it's a great documentary, you know, covering the work of, you know, not all of his work, because you can't fit everything in a 90-minute documentary. But, you know, the two things that he focuses on are obviously 9/11 and the way that the towers came down, but also his research into the anthrax attacks.
Sheesh, that sounds interesting.
So yeah, it's going to be, you know, it'd be nice to screen it. It's had a premiere in Canada, where Graham lived. It's had one in New York, and although it's on a smaller scale, we're going to be showing it on a big screen in London. So if people want to go, if they're local, if you go to Eventbrite and I guess just search for my name, Matt Campbell, you'll find it, and it's called the official story versus the truth, something like that. I hope people can come along.
Definitely. Piers Robertson's great.
Yeah, he's really good. He's actually he's on the board now of IC911.org, the International Centre for 9/11 Justice, that have helped me with what we're doing with the inquest. I actually met him about 5-6 years ago. I was at a music festival, and they had this thing called a rebel tent. And basically, someone came along and gave a talk that perhaps wasn't, it certainly wasn't mainstream, and he got a fair bit of flack. It was at a Beautiful Days festival in the UK, and so I met him there, and introduced myself and told him about my brother and various things about 9/11. Oddly enough, there's a chap there called Piers Corbyn, Jeremy Corbyn's brother, and he was talking about how global boiling's not going to kill us all, and he got a lot of flack there as well from people who obviously who have been persuaded otherwise, that we are all going to boil to death.
Unfortunately, you set yourself up for this one, but since you brought up the music festival that you were at, I can't help but notice that you have one of the most punk rock hairstyles I think I've seen in a long time. It reminds me of the Prodigy.
A little bit of inspiration there. It's options when you put. I've got great hair for radio, Jerm. I've got brilliant hair. But yeah, listen, partly inspired by the Prodigy.
Got about 12 or 13 minutes left. Tell me just quickly a little bit about the judicial review process.
Yeah, so it's a way in which in the UK you can challenge an authority's decision. So it's typically boring stuff like planning. So someone is trying to build a house somewhere, or a block of flats, and for some reason it's been blocked, or you're trying to block the building of those things. It's kind of boring stuff like that. There's about, I think, in any year there's about 2,000, 3,000 judicial review applications, and they're spread across civil cases like planning, some criminal, and a very small amount are what we're doing, which is challenging a body like the Attorney General. And I can't remember the exact stats. It was quite daunting when I first looked at it. A lot are thrown out because they are absolutely without merit. Some get to various stages. So there's, like I talked about earlier, there was a pre-application